Imagine the astonishment that befell him the following morning when a young lady, Miss Annie G. Ellsworth, offered him congratulations at breakfast for the successful passage of his bill. At first he could scarcely believe the good news, but upon realizing that Miss Ellsworth spoke the truth, his joy knew no bounds. He promised her that she could choose the first message. The next year, in 1844, a telegraph line stretching from Baltimore to Washington was ready for use. On the day of the trial, Morse met with a group of friends in the chamber of the Supreme Court at the Washington end of the line. Sitting at the instrument he had placed for the trial, the jubilant inventor sent the message dictated by Miss Ellsworth, "What hath God wrought?" The telegraph was a magnificent and brilliant achievement, bringing its inventor well-deserved fame. Morse married for a second time and resided in a stunning home on the Hudson, where he could easily communicate with distant friends using his instruments. He was a simple and modest man, a true-hearted and kindly Christian. He had a fondness for flowers and animals, and his most remarkable pet was a tame flying squirrel that would perch on his master's shoulders, eat from his hand, and slumber in his pocket. In his prosperity, Morse was showered with honors from many countries. At the suggestion of the French emperor, representatives from numerous European countries convened in Paris to determine a suitable testimonial for Morse as a world benefactor. These delegates voted to award him $80,000 in appreciation of his great invention. Before his death, a statue in his honor was erected in Central Park, New York. In 1872, this noble inventor, at the ripe age of 81, breathed his last. The genuine outpouring of grief from all over the country was evidence of the place he held in the hearts of the people. Chapter 24. Abraham Lincoln, the Liberator of the Slaves. As Morse toiled away at his invention, the nation was embroiled in a heated battle over slavery and state rights. In 1846, just 2 years after Morse's triumph, Congress declared war on Mexico as a result of this bitter conflict. The Southern slaveholders saw this war as an opportunity to acquire new territory from their weaker neighbor, which could be used to extend the reach of slavery. Slavery had been on the decline in the states east of the Mississippi and north of the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River. However, the soil and climate in the South were ideal for growing rice, cotton, sugar, and tobacco, which required large plantations and a great deal of cheap labor. Slavery was the perfect solution to this problem, and it was seen as essential to the prosperity of the South. In contrast, the soil and climate in the North were not conducive to the use of slaves, which is why slavery gradually died out in that region. As a result, there was a pressing demand for slavery in the South, but none in the North. Over time, it became clear that the North was growing in population, wealth, and political influence much faster than the South. The slaveholders feared that Congress might eventually pass laws that were unfriendly to slavery, so they were determined to extend slavery as far as possible into the territory west of the Mississippi. However, opposition to the spread of slavery to new states became so powerful in the North that by 1855, a major political party had formed around this issue. One of the party's most inspiring leaders was Abraham Lincoln, who was born in Kentucky on February 12, 1809. Lincoln grew up in a rough log cabin with a lazy and ignorant father who didn't learn to read until his wife taught him. Lincoln's only playmates were his older sister Sarah and his cousin Dennis Hanks, who lived with the family. When young Abe was but 7 years of age, his family uprooted and made their way to Indiana, settling a mere 15 miles north of the Ohio River. The journey was long and arduous, with the family having to carve out a path through the dense forest. Upon their safe arrival in November, the family wasted no time in constructing a shelter to protect them from the harsh winter. Young Abe, being a healthy and active lad, worked tirelessly alongside his father from dawn till dusk, felling trees and cutting poles and boughs for their camp. This camp was nothing more than a small shed, measuring only 14 feet square and open on one side. It was constructed of poles stacked upon one another, and had a thatched roof made of boughs and leaves. As there was no chimney, a fire had to be kept burning constantly just outside the open side of the shed. The furnishings within the rough abode were meager and crude, much like those found in Boone's cabin. Three-legged stools made from smoothed, split logs with sticks inserted into auger holes served as chairs, while the tables were of a similar fashion, albeit with 4 legs. The crude bedsteads in the corners of the cabin were fashioned by inserting poles between the logs at right angles to the wall, with the outside corner where the logs met being supported by a crotched stick driven into the ground. Shucks and leaves were piled atop this framework for bedding, with wild animal skins thrown over the top for warmth. Pegs driven into the wall served as a stairway to the loft, where young Abe slept. In the space in front of the open side of the cabin, a large iron pot hung over the fire, in which the family cooked their meager meals. These backwoods people knew nothing of fancy cookery, but they had hearty appetites for their coarse fare. The primary vegetable was the humble white potato, and their bread took the form of corn dodgers, made from meal and roasted in the ashes. Wheat was so scarce that flour bread was reserved for Sunday mornings. However, there was generally an abundance of game, such as deer, bears, and wild turkeys, as well as many kinds of fish from the nearby streams and wild fruits from the woods during the summer months. In the wild woods of Indiana, during his first winter, little Abe lived a solitary life. However, it was a very active one. There was much to do in constructing the cabin that would replace the camp, and in felling trees and clearing land for the corn planting of the upcoming spring. Furthermore, Abe helped to provide food for the table, as he had already learned to use the rifle, hunt, and trap animals. These tasks took him into the woods, and despite all the hardships of his wilderness life, we must believe that he spent many joyful hours. If we could observe him as he set off with his gun, or as he chopped wood for the fires, we would undoubtedly find his attire somewhat unusual. He was a tall, lanky, clumsy boy, with very long legs and arms. In winter he wore moccasins, trousers, and a shirt made of deerskin, and a cap made of coonskin with the animal's tail hanging down behind to serve as both an ornament and a convenience in handling the cap. On a cold winter day, such a furry outfit might appear very comfortable if it were close-fitting, but we are informed that Abe's deerskin trousers, after becoming wet, shrank so much that they were several inches too short for his long, lean legs. As for stockings, he tells us he never wore them until he was a young man grown. However, although this outfit appears unusual to us, it did not seem so to his neighbors and friends, for they were accustomed to seeing boys dressed in that manner. The frontiersmen had to invent many devices to compensate for their lack of manufactured items. For example, they all used thorns for pins, bits of stone for buttons, homemade soap, and tallow-dipped candles. Candles were a luxury most of the time, and during Abe's childhood he was compelled to read by the light of the wood fire blazing in the crude fireplace of the log cabin during the long winter evenings. As great as his hardships had been in this Indiana home, Abe now had to endure a more severe loss in the death of his mother. The rugged life of the forest and the exposure of the open cabin had been too much for her fragile constitution. Before she died, she said to her son, "Abraham, I am departing from you, and you will never see me again. I know that you will always be good and kind to your sister and father. Try to live as I have taught you, and to love your heavenly Father." Many years later, Lincoln said, "All that I am, or I hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." A year after the tragic event, his father brought home a second wife, who became a devoted friend to the motherless boy. This woman was energetic, thrifty, and intelligent. She had been accustomed to better things than what she found in her new home, but she insisted that the log cabin should be supplied with a door, a floor, and windows. She immediately began to make the children look a little more human. Abraham Lincoln's schooling was brief, not more than a year in total. The schools he attended were nothing like the graded schools of today. The buildings were rough log cabins with the earth for a floor and oiled paper for windows. Desks were unknown, and the little schoolhouse was furnished with rude benches made of split logs after the manner of the stools and tables in the Lincoln home. The teachers were ignorant men who taught the children a little spelling, reading, writing, and ciphering. While attending the last school, Abe had to travel a distance of 4.5 miles daily from his home. Despite this meager schooling, however, the boy, by his self-reliance, resolute purpose, and good reading habits, acquired the very best sort of training for his future life. He had but few books at his home, and it was impossible in that wild country to find many in any other homes. Among those which he read over and over again while a boy were the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, A History of the United States, and Weems's Life of Washington. His stepmother said of him, "He read everything he could lay his hands on, and when he came across a passage that struck him, he would write it down on boards if he had no paper, and keep it before him until he could get paper. Then he would copy it, look at it, commit it to memory, and repeat it." His stepbrother recounted, "When Abe and I returned home from work, he would head straight to the cupboard, grab a piece of cornbread, take down a book, sit down, and prop his legs up as high as his head to read. When night fell, he would find a spot by the fireside or stretch out on the floor to write or work on arithmetic problems on a wooden shovel, using a charred stick as a writing tool. Once he had filled the shovel, he would shave off the surface and start over again." On one occasion, he borrowed a copy of the Life of Washington and took it to bed with him in the loft, reading until his candle burned out. Before going to sleep, he tucked the book into a crevice in the logs so that he could resume reading as soon as daylight permitted. However, a storm arose during the night, and the rain soaked the book through and through. With a heavy heart, Lincoln returned it to its owner, who offered to give it to him if he worked 3 days to pay for it. He eagerly agreed and carried his new possession home in triumph. This book had a profound impact on his future. Until he turned 20, his father hired him out for various jobs, earning as little as 31 cents a day or as much as $6 a month. Just before he reached adulthood, his family packed all their belongings into a cart pulled by 4 oxen and set out westward. For 2 weeks they traveled across the country to Illinois, finally settling on the banks of the Sangamon River, which flowed into the Ohio. The arduous journey took place in March, along muddy roads and swollen streams, with young Lincoln driving the oxen. Abraham, upon reaching the end of his journey, aided his father in constructing a dwelling and clearing and fencing 10 acres of land for cultivation. Following this, he struck a deal with his neighbor, Mrs. Nancy Miller, to split 400 rails for every yard of brown jeans required to fashion a pair of trousers. As Lincoln was a tall man, he needed 3½ yards, which meant he had to split 1,400 fence rails, a significant amount of work for a single pair of pants. He had often observed boats transporting goods up and down the river, and wondered where they were headed. Eager to experience the life he had dreamed of, he resolved to become a boatman. He thirsted for knowledge and applied himself with the same fervor and energy he had used to absorb the great ideas in his books, to learn about the river's commerce and the life along its banks. When an opportunity arose, he secured employment on a flatboat that conveyed corn, hogs, hay, and other farm produce to New Orleans. During one of his trips, he stumbled upon a slave auction. As he watched one slave after another being sold to the highest bidder, his anger grew until he exclaimed, "Boys, let's get away from this. If I ever get a chance to hit that thing," meaning slavery, "I'll hit it hard." He never imagined then that he would strike such a blow some 30 years later. Growing weary of his long voyages to New Orleans, he became a clerk in a village store in New Salem. Many tales are told of Lincoln's integrity as demonstrated in his dealings with the people in this village store. It is said that on one occasion a woman mistakenly overpaid him by 6 cents while making change. When Lincoln discovered the error, he walked 3 miles to return the money to the woman that same night. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was a towering figure with great strength and wrestling skills. Despite his aversion to fighting, he became the hero of a wrestling match with a young man named Armstrong, who was the leader of the rough youths in the area. Lincoln emerged victorious, and his sportsmanship earned him the lifelong friendship of his opponent. At times throughout his life, he experienced profound depression, which left his face unspeakably sad. However, he was generally cheerful and jolly, and his good humor and stories made him a popular figure at social gatherings and crossroads grocery stores. Despite being offered alcohol, he always declined, never indulging in strong liquor or tobacco. Lincoln was a man of great kindness and good nature. His stepmother once remarked, "I can say, what hardly one mother in 1,000 can say, he never gave me a cross word or look, and never refused in fact or appearance to do anything I asked him. He was also known for his tender-heartedness, as evidenced by an incident that occurred while he was riding with a group of men. When his companions realized he was missing, they went to look for him, and found that he had stopped to replace 2 young birds that had fallen out of their nest. He could not continue on until he had restored them to their home in the tree branches. After less than a year of working as a clerk in a village store, the store closed, and Lincoln found himself without employment. He then enlisted as a volunteer for the Black Hawk War, which had broken out around that time, and became captain of his company. Upon his return, he became part owner of a grocery store, but the venture failed. It is believed that his lack of interest in the business was a contributing factor, as he had begun to study law. Following the closure of his store, Lincoln served as postmaster in New Salem, where the mail was so scarce that he could carry it in his hat and deliver it to the recipients as he encountered them. He then turned to surveying, reportedly using a grapevine as his surveyor's chain. Throughout these years, Lincoln seemed to be drifting from one occupation to another without a clear direction. However, his interest in public affairs and his popularity continued to grow. In 1834, he ran for and won a seat in the state legislature. He even walked 100 miles with a pack on his back to reach the state capitol and begin his duties as a lawmaker. In the early days of his career, he pursued the study of law with great diligence, and after 4 years was granted admission to the bar. He set up shop in Springfield, Illinois, where he had spent much of his youth. Even as a boy, he had a knack for delivering speeches, and he soon found that this talent could be put to good use in his political pursuits. He was elected to Congress, where he became increasingly interested in the issue of slavery and other public matters. As he delved deeper into the question of slavery, he became convinced that it was a great evil that needed to be eradicated. His passion for the cause won him many supporters, and in 1858 he was nominated by the Republican Party for a seat in the United States Senate. His opponent was Stephen A. Douglas, a diminutive man with a powerful voice and a reputation as a skilled orator. The debates between the 2 men were legendary, and their eloquence and passion captured the attention of the entire nation. Lincoln argued forcefully against the spread of slavery into new territories, but despite his best efforts, he was unable to secure a seat in the Senate. Nevertheless, his reputation continued to grow, and in 1860 he was nominated by the Republican National Convention as their candidate for president. The election that followed was one of the most contentious in American history. The issue of slavery had divided the nation, with the South eager to expand its influence by adding more slave states to the Union, while the North was determined to prevent this from happening. Lincoln campaigned on a platform of limiting the spread of slavery, and his message resonated with voters across the country. In the end, he emerged victorious, and he was inaugurated as president in the spring of 1861. The question of slavery continued to dominate the national conversation, and Lincoln was determined to find a way to resolve the issue once and for all. He believed that slavery was a moral evil that could not be allowed to continue, and he was willing to take bold action to bring it to an end. In the years that followed, he would lead the nation through one of its darkest periods, as the Civil War raged on and the fate of the Union hung in the balance. But through it all, he remained steadfast in his commitment to the cause of freedom, and his legacy as one of America's greatest leaders endures to this day. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was believed to have settled the issue of slavery for all time. But alas, it was not to be. The trouble flared up again, as bitter as ever, over the Mexican Cession, which became our territory as a result of the Mexican War. Once again it was hoped that a compromise, this time in 1850, would bring an end to the struggle. But even after this second compromise, the agitation over slavery continued to grow more and more bitter until the election of Mr. Lincoln. At that time, some of the southern states threatened to secede or withdraw from the Union. These states claimed the right to decide for themselves whether or not they should remain in the Union. On the other hand, the North declared that no state could secede from the Union without the consent of the other states. Before Lincoln was inaugurated, 7 of the Southern states had seceded. The excitement was intense everywhere. Many people felt that a man of greater experience than Lincoln should be at the head of the government. They doubted the ability of this plain man of the people, this awkward backwoodsman, to lead the nation in these delicate and intricate times. But, as little as they knew it, he was well suited for the task that lay before him. While on his way to Washington for the inauguration, his friends learned of a plot to assassinate him when he passed through Baltimore. To save him from violence, they convinced him to change his route and make the last part of his journey in secret. In a few weeks, the Civil War had begun. We cannot pause here for a full account of all of Lincoln's trials and difficulties during this fearful struggle that began in 1861 and ended in 1865. His burdens were almost overwhelming, but like Washington, he believed that right makes might, and that it must prevail. When he ascended to the presidency, he proclaimed that the Constitution granted him no authority to meddle with slavery in the states where it existed. Nevertheless, as the war raged on, he grew convinced that the slaves, by remaining on the plantations and providing sustenance for the Southern soldiers, were a significant boon to the Southern cause, and thus posed a threat to the Union. As commander-in-chief of the Union armies, he therefore resolved to emancipate the slaves in all territories whose inhabitants were fighting against the Union. He took this action as a military necessity. The celebrated official document, in which Lincoln declared that the slaves were free in all the territories of the seceded states, whose people were waging war against the Union, was dubbed the Emancipation Proclamation. He issued it on January 1, 1863, and thus fulfilled his promise, "If ever I get a chance to strike that thing," meaning slavery, "I'll strike it hard." On April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered his army to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, thereby bringing the war to a close. Rejoicing erupted everywhere, but suddenly the universal joy turned into universal sorrow. 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington with his wife and some friends. In the middle of the performance, a half-insane actor who was familiar with the theater entered the president's box and shot him in the back of the head. After that, he leaped onto the stage shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always to tyrants," and dashed through the wing to the street. There he mounted a horse that was waiting for him and fled, but was soon tracked down and killed in a barn where he was hiding. The martyr president lingered for several hours, tenderly cared for by his family and a few friends. When he breathed his last the following morning, Secretary Stanton spoke the truth when he said, "Now he belongs to the ages." A noble life had departed from the arena of action, and the people mourned deeply the loss of the man who had wisely and courageously guided them through 4 years of arduous trial and anxiety. As wise and courageous as Abraham Lincoln's leadership was, however, the drain of the Civil War on the nation's strength was nearly overwhelming. Nearly 600,000 men lost their lives in this murderous conflict, and the loss in wealth was not far short of $8 billion. The war, though fraught with tragedy, did yield some positive outcomes. One of these was enshrined in the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which forever abolished slavery in the Union. Another consequence was the eradication of the pernicious doctrines of state rights, nullification, and secession. Webster's belief that the Union was supreme over the states had now become an incontrovertible fact. The Union was one and indivisible. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered in Washington on March 4, 1865, only 6 weeks before his untimely death, contains words that will forever be remembered. The speech is remarkable for its compassion, tenderness, and simple beauty, which reveal the heart of the man who spoke them. The address concluded with these immortal lines, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Chapter 25. Ulysses Simpson Grant and the Civil War. In the annals of the illustrious life of the martyr president, we have briefly touched upon the causes and consequences of the Civil War. It was a conflict that tested the mettle of both sides, and each could boast of the valor and military prowess of its officers and soldiers. Indeed, each side could count among its ranks some of the greatest military minds in history. One such individual, universally recognized as the most capable general to lead Northern troops into battle, was Ulysses Simpson Grant. Born in a modest abode in Point Pleasant, Ohio, in April of 1822, Grant's family relocated to Georgetown, Ohio, the following year, where they resided for many years. His father was a farmer and leather manufacturer, but young Ulysses did not take to the leather trade, preferring instead the various tasks of farm work. At the tender age of 7, he would haul all the necessary wood for both the family home and the leather factory from a forest located a mile from the village. Although he was too small to load and unload the wood, the men would assist him in that regard. From the ages of 11 to 17, as he recounted in his personal memoirs, Grant plowed the fields, tended to the growing crops of corn and potatoes, sawed firewood for his father's store, and performed any other duties that would typically fall to a farmer's son. He also enjoyed leisure activities such as fishing, swimming in the nearby creek, skating in the winter, and driving around the countryside in both summer and winter. Young Grant had a fondness for horses, and quickly became an accomplished rider. Lincoln once shared a tale about him that not only demonstrated his equestrian skills, but also his tenacity. While attending a circus one day, the manager offered a silver dollar to anyone who could ride a particular mule around the ring. Several individuals attempted to mount the animal, only to be thrown over its head. Ulysses was among those who volunteered to ride, but like the others, he was unsuccessful. Undeterred, he removed his coat and mounted the mule once more. He wrapped his legs tightly around the animal's body and grabbed hold of its tail, riding triumphantly around the ring to the cheers of the expectant crowd. He didn't care much for book learning, but his old man wanted him to have the best education money could buy, so he got him a spot at West Point. That was a real chance to learn all about scholarship, but he wasn't too keen on it. He was good with numbers and could ride a horse like nobody's business, but other than that, he didn't care much for what they taught at that fancy military school. He ended up ranking 21st out of 39 in his class. After he graduated, he wanted to stick around and teach math at West Point, but then the Mexican War broke out, and he had to go fight. That's when he showed everyone what he was made of. He did this one super dangerous ride. He said, "I made sure to sit on the side of my horse that was farthest from the enemy. I held on with just one foot and one arm, and then I took off at full speed. The only time I was really in danger was when I crossed the streets, but I went so fast that I was usually past the enemy and under cover before they could even shoot at me. I made it out without a scratch." After the war was over, he got hitched. 6 years later, he quit the army and moved his family to a farm near St. Louis. He worked hard, but it was tough to make ends meet. Eventually, he got sick and had to give up farming. He tried selling real estate, but that didn't work out either. Finally, his old man offered him a job at his store, where he worked as a clerk until the Civil War broke out. When he heard that the Southern troops had attacked Fort Sumter, he knew he had to do something. He joined the army again and got right to work preparing for war. He started out as a colonel and then became a brigadier general. Finally, he had found his calling. He was a natural leader, and he quickly rose through the ranks. In the annals of American history, few names are as revered as that of General Ulysses S. Grant. His first great achievement came in the capture of Forts Henry and Donelson, which were the center of a strong Confederate line of defense, extending from Columbus to Cumberland Gap. At Fort Donelson, he received the surrender of nearly 15,000 prisoners, and his great victory compelled the Confederates to abandon two of their most important strongholds, Columbus and Nashville. After the loss of Fort Donelson, the Confederates fell back to a second line of defense, extending from Memphis through Corinth to Chattanooga. The Confederate Army took position at Corinth, while General Grant's army was stationed at Pittsburgh Landing, 18 miles away. It was here, early on Sunday morning, April the 6th, 1862, that Grant was attacked by Johnston, and his men were driven back 1.5 miles toward the river. It was a fearful battle, lasting until nearly dark. Not until after midnight was Grant able to rest, and then as he sat in the rain leaning against the foot of a tree, he slept a few hours before the renewal of battle on Monday morning. With reinforcements, he was able to drive the enemy off the field on the second day and win a signal victory. Through this battle, Grant broke the second Confederate line of defense. Although the Confederates fought bravely and well to prevent the Northern troops from getting control of the Mississippi River, by the close of 1862 they had lost every stronghold except Port Hudson and Vicksburg. In 1863, General Grant put forth a resolute effort to capture Vicksburg, and after a brilliant campaign laid siege to the city. For 7 weeks the Confederate army held out. Meanwhile the people of Vicksburg found shelter in caves and cellars, their food at times consisting of rats and mule flesh. But on July the 4th, 1863, the day following General Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, General Pemberton, with an army of about 32,000 men, surrendered Vicksburg to General Grant. 4 days later, Port Hudson was captured, and thus the last stronghold of the Mississippi came under the control of the North. General Grant's success was in no small measure due to his dogged perseverance. While his army was laying siege to Vicksburg, a Confederate woman, at whose door he stopped to ask for a drink of water, inquired whether he expected ever to capture Vicksburg. "Certainly," he replied. "But when?" was her next question. Quickly came the answer. "I cannot tell exactly when I shall take the town, but I mean to stay here till I do, if it takes me 30 years. In 1864, General Grant, having proven himself to be a capable leader through his effective campaigns, was appointed lieutenant general by President Lincoln. This promotion placed him in command of all the Northern forces. In presenting the new commission, Lincoln spoke these words to General Grant: "As the country trusts you, so, under God, it will sustain you." General Grant replied, "I feel the full weight of the responsibilities now upon me, and I know that if they are met, it will be due to those armies, and above all, to the favor of that Providence which leads both nations and men." In the early days of May 1864, General Grant began his final campaign in Virginia. While he marched with his army on to Richmond, General Sherman led his army on to Atlanta and on to the sea in Georgia. Both generals were skilled, and both faced formidable opponents. Grant crossed the Rapidan and entered the Wilderness, where Lee's army contested every inch of his advance. In the fierce fighting that followed, Grant suffered significant losses. However, with bulldog grit, as Lincoln put it, he pressed on, writing to the President his unwavering determination, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." And it did take all summer and more, for Grant found it impossible to capture Richmond by attacking it from the north. He therefore moved his army across the James River and attacked the city from the south. But even at the end of the summer, Lee still held out. It was not until April 2, 1865, that Lee was forced to retreat toward the west. Grant pursued him closely for a week, during which Lee's troops suffered greatly, subsisting mainly on parched corn and young tree shoots. Recognizing that the Southern cause was lost, the distinguished leader of the Confederate armies, after a most brilliant retreat, decided that the time had come to surrender. It was a momentous day when General Grant, suffering from a severe sick headache, received a note from General Lee expressing his willingness to consider terms of surrender. The two eminent generals met on a Sunday morning in the McLean House, located in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. Grant, in his personal memoirs, recounts that he was without a sword, as was his custom when on horseback, and wore a soldier's blouse as a coat, with the shoulder straps of his rank to indicate his identity to the army. General Lee, on the other hand, was dressed in a full uniform that was entirely new, and wore a sword of considerable value, likely the one presented by the state of Virginia. In his rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with the straps of a lieutenant general, Grant must have appeared a stark contrast to the handsome 6-foot-tall Lee, with his faultless form and elegant attire. The outcome of their meeting was the surrender of General Lee and his entire army of 26,000 men. General Grant demonstrated his great kindness of heart and fine delicacy of feeling by issuing orders that all Confederates who owned horses and mules should be allowed to take them home. "They will need them for the spring plowing," he said. He spared the vanquished troops the humiliation of marching out and stacking their arms in token of surrender, and even stopped the firing of salutes by his men. Never did General Grant appear more truly great than on the occasion of Lee's surrender. Thus ended the military career of the greatest general that the North produced during the Civil War. During his time in the Army, Grant seemed to possess marvelous powers of endurance. He once said of himself, "Whether I slept on the ground or in a tent, whether I slept 1 hour or 10 in the 24, whether I had 1 meal or 3 or none made no difference. I could lie down and sleep in the rain without caring." He was not a man who looked like he was in good health. Standing at a mere 5 feet and 8 inches, he had a hunched posture and lacked the military bearing of a soldier. His hair was brown, his eyes blue, and his voice had a musical quality to it. He had a cheerful disposition and a pure soul, never uttering a vulgar word or telling a questionable tale. He was calm and unassuming, never losing his cool even in the midst of battle, always prepared for the toughest of challenges. It goes without saying that at the end of the war, he had won the hearts of his fellow countrymen. Everywhere he went, people flocked to see him. But like Washington and Jefferson before him, he found public speaking to be a daunting task. On one occasion, in the presence of friends, General Grant's young son, Jesse, climbed atop a haystack and said, "I'll show you how Papa makes a speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad to see you. I thank you very much. Good night." Everyone present found this amusing except for Grant himself, who was embarrassed by his son's accurate portrayal. Grant was elected President of the United States in 1868 and served 2 terms. After leaving office, he embarked on a world tour and was received with great honor and distinction by rulers and people alike. In his final days, he suffered greatly from an incurable disease, which proved to be a more formidable foe than any he had faced on the battlefield. After 9 months of struggle, he passed away on July the 23rd, 1885, at Mount McGregor near Saratoga. His body was laid to rest in Riverside Park on the Hudson, where a magnificent monument was erected in his honor in 1897. Like Lincoln and Washington, he will forever be remembered in the hearts of his fellow countrymen. Chapter 26. Some Leaders and Heroes in the War with Spain. Throughout our exploration of American history, we have focused on the notable events that revolve around leaders and heroes. Each chapter has highlighted the accomplishments of a single individual. However, it is important to acknowledge that these leaders could not have succeeded without the cooperation of many others who remain unnamed. This is true not only in America, but in all countries and times. Our country's history is filled with examples of individual heroism and devotion to the flag, and we can find no better example than in the recent war with Spain. This war showcased the strong and manly qualities of American life and character, and it is fitting that we briefly examine a few recent events that help us understand the people we have become and what we can accomplish in times of earnest endeavor. Spain ruled Cuba with extreme cruelty and oppression from the very beginning of its dominion. The Cubans rose in rebellion again and again, driven to desperation by unjust treatment, but without success. In 1895 they organized an uprising that Spain could not put down. In the last extremity of its power, Spain sent over a governor-general who tried to starve the Cubans into submission. A large part of the population lived in the country, and provided the Cuban troops with food and recruits. The Spanish commander's brutal method was to drive these country people into the towns and cities, burning their homes and destroying everything that might be of use to feed and support the fighting Cubans. But the Cubans were determined to win their independence or die in the attempt. As the war raged on and the cruel policy of starvation grew more savage, the United States was filled with horror and indignation. Our government attempted to persuade Spain to cease her barbaric ways, but while negotiations were underway, a tragic event occurred that only fueled the anger of Americans toward Spain. On the night of February the 15th, 1898, the USS Maine, one of our battleships, was destroyed in the harbor of Havana, killing 266 sailors. Many believed that this heinous act was the work of Spanish officials, and this belief only grew stronger when a thorough investigation was conducted by a naval court of inquiry. Throughout the country, people became increasingly agitated until they were ready to go to war with Spain if she did not change her ways towards Cuba. However, Spain was obstinate, and President McKinley, after exhausting all efforts to prevent hostilities, was forced to declare in a message that the war in Cuba must stop. On April the 25th, 1898, Congress took the monumental step of declaring war. Our Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Long, wasted no time in sending a message to Commodore Dewey, who commanded an American fleet of 6 warships in Hong Kong, instructing him to immediately proceed to the Philippine Islands and either capture or destroy the Spanish fleet stationed there. 2 days later, Commodore Dewey's fleet was sailing southward towards Manila Bay, searching for the Spanish squadron of 10 warships and 2 torpedo boats. It was crucial that these warships be captured or destroyed before they could reach our Pacific coast and attack American cities. On the night before May the 1st, our fleet entered Manila Bay. The defining moment in the life of Commodore Dewey, who was 62 years old at the time, had arrived. He was 7,000 miles away from home and in hostile waters. Without even a pilot to guide his fleet as it boldly and slowly moved into the bay, he knew that he might be walking into a death trap. 2 torpedoes exploded just ahead of the flagship Olympia, which was leading the way, but the fearless commander did not waver from his course. As they approached Bacoor Bay, just a stone's throw from Manila, the Spanish fleet lay in wait, flanked by formidable shore batteries. 3 miles out, Commodore Dewey turned to the captain of the Olympia and calmly uttered, "If you are ready, Gridley, you may fire." Spanish shells had already rained down on the American fleet, but the Spanish gunners were woefully inept, causing little damage. The American ships advanced in single file, with the Olympia leading the charge. They sailed towards Manila, then turned back, unleashing devastating broadsides on the Spanish fleet with each pass. 5 times they repeated this maneuver, each time drawing closer to the enemy and unleashing a more ferocious and deadly barrage. At 7 o'clock, the Spanish flagship made a bold move, charging towards the Olympia as if to ram it. But the American vessels concentrated their fire on the flagship, forcing it to retreat. As it turned away, the Olympia fired a shell that tore through its deck, killing or injuring 60 sailors and the captain. At the same time, 2 Spanish torpedo boats raced towards the American fleet. One of them headed straight for the Olympia, intent on blowing it up. But a well-placed shell exploded on the torpedo boat's deck, sending it to the bottom of the sea. After 2 hours of intense fighting, it was clear that the Spanish fleet was on its last legs. Commodore Dewey decided to give his exhausted men a break. He withdrew his fleet from the battle and allowed his brave sailors to have breakfast. 3 hours later they resumed the fight, which ended with the complete annihilation of the Spanish fleet. Although 1,200 Spaniards were killed or wounded, not a single American lost their life, and only 8 were injured. None of Dewey's ships suffered serious damage. The battle was a stunning display of the American sailors' exceptional training and seamanship, as their rapid and precise handling of the guns was nothing short of miraculous. The news of the glorious victory in Manila Bay electrified the people with joy when it was cabled to America. On May 9th, Congress voted to spend $10,000 to secure a sword for Commodore Dewey and medals for all his men, and President McKinley promptly appointed him a rear admiral. Before the middle of August, an army of 15,000 troops, under General Merritt, was sent to Manila to unite with the fleet under Admiral Dewey in capturing the city. Manila surrendered on August 13th. With the destruction of the Spanish fleet at Manila, within a week after Congress declared war, all danger of attack from Spanish war vessels upon our Pacific coast was at an end. But there was grave fear that the Spanish fleet under Admiral Cervera might attack the large and wealthy cities upon our Atlantic coast. Shortly after the war began, this fleet was reported to have left the Cape Verde Islands and to have directed its course toward Cuban waters. At once, Americans began to ask serious questions that nobody could answer. "Where is Cervera going?" they asked. "Will he try to break the blockade which an American fleet under Admiral Sampson is keeping up on the northern coast of Cuba? Will he try to intercept and destroy the battleship Oregon? Or will he bring havoc and destruction upon us by sailing straight for some great Atlantic seaport? Americans looked anxious and worried as they considered these questions. But the uncertainty did not last long, for soon it was learned by cable that Cervera had stopped at Martinique and later at a small island off the coast of Venezuela, from where he had speedily steamed northward toward Cuba. We now know that he went to Santiago Harbor, which he thought would prove a good hiding place while his fleet took on board coal and other supplies. Shortly after Cervera's arrival at Santiago, an American fleet under Commodore Schley discovered him and blockaded the harbor to prevent his escape. It was extremely important to keep him bottled up there until an American army might come down and capture Santiago and the Spanish army which held the place. This capture accomplished, Cervera would have to fight either in the harbor or out on the open sea. But there was still some anxiety, lest he might on some dark, stormy night manage to steal out and make his escape. In the days of the Spanish-American War, the entrance to Santiago Harbor was a formidable obstacle for any ship attempting to enter. The channel was narrow, no more than 100 yards wide at its narrowest point, and well protected by headlands surmounted by batteries. The Spanish had planted torpedoes in the channel, and the sinking of a single vessel would block the way for all the rest. It was a treacherous path to navigate, and the Spanish fleet knew it. Admiral Sampson, aware of the danger, planned to obstruct the entrance to Santiago Harbor to prevent the Spanish fleet from getting out. Lieutenant Hobson, a young man of 28, was tasked with sinking the collier Merrimac across the channel. Torpedoes were arranged on the sides of the Merrimac, so that their explosion would shatter her bottom and sink her into the channel. Selecting the crew for this perilous mission was no easy task. Hundreds of American sailors were eager to go, even though they knew the risks of capture or death. But only a small number of brave, cool-headed men were chosen for the job. Such was the heroic temper of the American sailors that many of them begged for an opportunity to render this loyal service. On the night of the mission, the Merrimac did not get well started before the morning light began to appear in the eastern sky, so Admiral Sampson recalled the expedition. The crew waited anxiously for another chance to carry out their mission. The next morning, June the 3rd, the Merrimac set off again. The vessel moved stealthily forward with its eager, silent crew, but before they could reach the place of sinking, the Spaniards discovered them. Suddenly a storm of shot and shell beat in pitiless fury about the Merrimac, but she pressed forward. When the moment came for her to be swung across the channel, Hobson found that the rudder of the ship had been shot away, so he had to be content with sinking her along instead of across the channel. It was a daring feat, and though it did not go exactly according to plan, it was a testament to the bravery and determination of the American sailors. When the torpedoes exploded and the ship sank, the crew of 8 men struggled for their lives in the seething waters. They managed to reach a float that they had brought with them on the deck of the collier. They clung to the float, hanging on with their hands, for they dared not expose their bodies as targets to Spanish soldiers on land, or to Spanish sailors in the launches that were trying to find out what had happened. For some hours, Lieutenant Hobson and his men remained in this uncomfortable position, shivering with the cold. At length, Hobson hailed an approaching launch to which he swam. He was pulled in by an elderly man who exclaimed, "You are brave fellows." This was Admiral Cervera, who treated the prisoners with great kindness. With the rest of the world, he admired the courageous spirit of the brave fellows who had given so much in the service of their country. During the remainder of June, the American fleet kept watch at the harbor entrance. Before the end of the month, an American army of 15,000 men was ready to advance through a tropical forest upon the Spanish defenses outside of Santiago. On July the 1st, the Americans made a vigorous attack upon these outworks and won a glorious victory. It looked to Cervera as if he might be compelled to surrender his fleet without striking a blow. Although he was likely to suffer defeat in a battle, there was nothing to gain by remaining in the harbor. So he decided to dash boldly out in a desperate effort to escape. When at about 9:30 of that quiet Sunday morning, July the 3rd, the foremost Spanish war vessel was seen heading at full speed out of the harbor, the American sailors sent up a shout, "The Spanish fleet is coming out!" and leaped forward to their places at the guns. As in Manila, The battle was one-sided. The superior seamanship and gunnery of the Americans enabled them quickly to win a victory as brilliant as that won by Dewey and his men. Every Spanish vessel was destroyed, 600 Spaniards were killed, and 1,300 captured. Not one American ship was seriously injured, while only one American was killed and another one badly wounded. About the middle of July, Santiago and a Spanish army of 22,000 men surrendered to the Americans. Although this ended the serious fighting of the war, the Treaty of Peace was not ratified by the United States Senate until February 6, 1899. In accordance with this treaty, Spain gave up Cuba and ceded Puerto Rico to the United States. She also ceded to us the Philippine Islands, in return for which we agreed to pay $20 million. Some of the most remarkable outcomes of the war with Spain were not even mentioned in the treaty. Spain had hoped that one or more of the great powers of Europe would come to her aid. Some of these powers, with a clear dislike for the United States, were ready to interfere in Spain's interests. However, England refused to take part in this movement. Their friendly attitude towards us during this struggle has done much to bring our two countries into closer sympathy with each other. This goodwill towards England was especially evident at the time of Queen Victoria's death in January 1901. Ultimately, the United States was unified by the war, and prepared America for a leading role on the world stage, which was timely, as storm clouds were forming on the horizon. The end.
This concludes American History, The Legends of America, written by Doug Richardson. Narrated by Calvin T. Hartung. Visit brooksaudioBooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.